Good morning, my fellow optimists. How are we doing today? Never in the recent history of messaging has one leader have as much influence as our keynote speaker. Ajit Pai has shown that a principled, pragmatic, and unflappable regulator can make the marketplace more equitable and consumer-friendly. To give you context of how long he's been with the FCC, when he started, text messaging was used for a little more than coupons. And I don't need to tell this room that now two-factor authentication is just one of the many use cases that's making text messaging easier and better. I had to go through a long list of accomplishments, but I took out 3 because in his 8 years, 4 of them as chair, he implemented a comprehensive COVID response program, including a $200 million COVID telehealth initiative, conducted the highest grossing spectrum auction in American history, garnering over $80 billion in bids, beating the old target of $36 billion. And one that you might be most familiar with in this room, restored the long-standing bipartisan regulatory treatment of data, voice, and SMS. When thanking the men and women of the FCC, Commissioner Pai said that they weren't marking time, they made a difference. The same could be said about Ajit Pai's tenure as chair. Through tremendous change and chaos, his steady hand and transformative leadership made a difference. In fact, all of us continue to operate in a world that the Pai FCC put in place. Now, as a private citizen and an investor, for all of you seeking investments, his insights, experience, and vision are of tremendous interest to all of us, and we're excited about what he will share with us today. Please join me in welcoming Ajit Pai.
Well, thank you so much, TJ, for that warm introduction. Incredible praise. I can't say enough about it. I only wish that my mother were here. And the primary reason is that even after 8 years at the FCC, 2 presidential appointments, including appointment as the head of the premier telecommunications agency in the United States, even after I left, she still held out hope that I would finally make something of myself and go to medical school. But it still has not come to pass, unfortunately. But thanks as well to MEF, or MEF, I suppose it is called, and in particular, molto grazie to Dario for the invitation for hosting this event. It's incredible to see a crowd here, but even more than that, I think it's the nature of the forum. I was touched by the remarks he said that this is a place to think and to talk and to listen and to learn. And that is such an oasis in the current cacophony where people shout and pound the table and just want to hear their own point of view. So thank you for creating a forum here and just more generally where people can talk about the complex issues of messaging writ large. Now, TJ has asked me to spend the next 60 minutes or so talking about the history of telecom regulation in the US. So I thought I would start with the Interstate Commerce Act of 1881, then we'll work our way forward from there. But no, in all seriousness, I've done a fair amount of public speaking in my life, including, of course, during my 4 years in the corner office. But I'm somewhat nervous taking the stage at this moment, and that's for a few different reasons. Number one, I'm keenly aware that of all the people in the room, I'm likely the least knowledgeable about the particular sector that we were talking about. Secondly, I will say that although the coffee here is good, the receptacle is not of the size that I'm typically used to, for those of you who know the mug with which I've been associated. But most of all, I think it's that the only thing more dangerous to an audience's appeal anyway, than hearing a telecom regulator drone on about all the things he's doing is hearing a former telecom regulator talk about all the things that he did. So I have 3 strikes against me from the get-go. I recognize that, and will do my best to accommodate. But in all seriousness, I've had a chance to reflect. It's now been 615 days since I left the FCC, and now I'm a partner at Searchlight Capital, which is a private equity firm that invests broadly in telecom, media, and tech companies. If you're interested, let me know, because we really believe that the future is bright for those who are pursuing disruptive innovation and who have the determination to get the job done. Of course, the remarks I give today are not necessarily attributable to Searchlight, although I would hope that they would agree with the vast majority of what I'm going to say. But I thought I'd just start briefly with a few comments about what we did at the FCC and then focus on messaging in particular. There are a lot of things that I've had the chance to think about that I'm really proud of. And when I say I'm proud of, I don't mean because I was the one who got the results. It's because the FCC working together as a team, 1,500 people organized around a common purpose, got this job done. One of them, of course, is helping to close the digital divide. This is something that was very personal to me. I grew up in rural Kansas on a dirt road outside of a small town of about 9,000 people in southeast Kansas. And when I went home, I would regularly see the effects of the digital divide on my friends and those who I knew in the town. And so we did a lot to try to change that, to restore a regulatory framework that maximized the incentives to invest and innovate in high-speed broadband networks. We also tried to reform the USF or other types of subsidy programs to make sure that the American taxpayer was getting better bang for the buck. If the taxpayer was giving money to a private entity to build out broadband networks, they should build out broadband networks at a time specified. And those results have been making a big impact. Additionally, I'm really happy to see that Congress in a bipartisan way has pushed forward more infrastructure funding to help get that job done. Secondly, the work we did on wireless. And part of the reason why I have much more gray hair now than I did in 2017 when I got the job is because we were very aggressive in terms of spectrum. And I don't mean just licensed spectrum, but unlicensed as well. I told my team at the get-go, as I mentioned to TJ when we talked a couple of weeks ago, that I was very determined when I got the job that we were not just going to color within the lines and try to make a mark, but if we didn't, no problem. When it came to spectrum, I recognized that the US was essentially a competition with other countries, other regions of the world, and we wanted to make sure that we removed the spectrum availability as a constraint on wireless innovation. And part of that involved, of course, spectrum auctions. The C-band auction, which he was very kind to mention, raising $81 billion for the Treasury, but that was just one of many in mid-band and high-band spectrum auctions that we held. Also, very importantly to me, one of the things I noticed, and perhaps you've noticed it too when you check into a hotel or you go to the airport, is that Wi-Fi channels had become increasingly congested. So often they relied solely on a 2.4 gigahertz channel. And if you have a lot of people getting together, the capacity, the throughput was very slow. And so I instructed my team, I know we're going to get opposition from the wireless carriers. I know we're going to get opposition from electric utilities. I know we'll get opposition from broadcasters, but it's important for us to turbocharge the next generation of innovators who want to be able to innovate on a platform without spectrum constraints. And so we freed up the entire 6 gigahertz band, 1,200 megahertz for Wi-Fi 6E. And we're only scratching the surface of what is possible. Now, if you go to your neighborhood Costco, as I've done, you'll see Wi-Fi 6E routers out there. You'll see innovators starting to tinker with it. But I'm telling you, in the time to come, IoT, all kinds of applications are going to explode because of the availability of Wi-Fi. So in terms of spectrum, I'm really happy about a lot of the work that we did, overcoming resistance from a number of federal agencies and private stakeholders as well. I don't know if you know, but in the United States, typically the FCC does not have jurisdiction over all spectrum. As it happens, the Department of Commerce has jurisdiction over spectrum held by the federal government. And so quite often when we are holding a spectrum auction or freeing up spectrum for Wi-Fi, I would have to go hat in hand to the Department of Commerce and say, please, and if that didn't work, just to try to move ahead anyway. And so it is quite something, I have to say, when you're, for example, in the Oval Office battling it out and you're sitting there, or I was sitting there in my rumpled suit and ill-fitting tie against, say, the Department of Defense, the Secretary of the Defense Department, the Joint Chief of Staff saying, no, if we free up the spectrum, GPS is going to end, planes are going to fall out of the sky, et cetera. But we persisted and we got the job done. And I think the wireless sector in the US is, I would argue, one of the most innovative in the entire world as a result. Just a few other quick initiatives I'm really proud of that I'll mention in passing, but one is a personal cause of mine. As you may know, suicide prevention and mental health has reached crisis levels in the United States with rates now that have not been seen since World War II. And one of the things that I noticed is that it's very hard to remember in a pinch when you're struggling in the middle of the night, who do you call for help? There's a National Suicide Prevention Hotline, which is 1-800-273-TALK or 273-8255. It's hard to remember an 11-digit number. And so one of the things Congress asked the FCC to look at is there a 3-digit number that we can use? And we identified 988 as the best way to do that. It's kind of got an echo of 911. That number went active nationwide on July 16th of this year. And we're already getting reports of thousands of people who've been saved because they've been able to call that 3-digit number and get help in a moment of need. And so that's one of the areas that no one's ever going to talk about the legacy. Oh, thank you. So one of the things I told my team is that the people out there who are going to benefit from this, they will probably never know our names, but they're going to be very grateful that we did the work, and I'm glad we did. The last thing I'll mention is that the second to last thing I'm mentioning that I'm proud of is the work we did confronting national security threats, in particular, the threats presented by companies like Huawei and ZTE. The previous administration had a philosophy of constructive engagement with the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese telecom sector. And we fundamentally changed that after reviewing information, both classified and not, that suggested that a lot of this equipment that was already in US networks or could go into US networks was insecure. And so we banned the use of federal funding from being used on insecure equipment as determined by the national security and intelligence communities. We also made sure we instituted a program to get some of that equipment out, and we forged a bipartisan consensus around the country and around the world to help attack this problem. And the last one I'll mention is just something that those of you who are in complex organizations might appreciate, but just changing how the agency operates. One of the things I told my team was that I'd never want to see my calendar unfilled with events that recognize the staff for the great work that we're doing. If it's a retirement event, it's a birthday, affinity groups, whatever it is, you put it on my calendar because I want the team to know that we are one team. And I'm really proud of the sense of camaraderie we have. And to this day, I still get messages from some of my former coworkers at the FCC, like, oh, you remember this time we were in Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria? And yeah, it was just such a crazy time, but we're glad we were there with you. We did such great work. And those are the types of things that make me appreciate the fact that we really did the best we could to make it one consistent team. So anyway, a lot of different areas, but the common thread still, a lot of these are, number one, again, organizing around a common purpose. Number two, maximizing the incentives to invest and innovate. Number three, preferring competition as opposed to preemptive regulation as the way to best incentivize change in a marketplace. And finally, looking at the terms of the law. I mean, the FCC is created by the Communications Act, by Congress. We can't just make it up and put our fingers in the wind. We have to put our finger on the problem according to the terms set forth by Congress. And that kind of leads me to the messaging, which I'll mention, and I'll be as brief as I can because I know that TJ will likely have some questions, as might you. But here, one of the things I found is that it was a sort of a strange situation where the law has essentially remained in place since 1991 with a few tweaks here and there, but the marketplace has changed dramatically. And this is an area where it seemed to me that it's sort of the classic Washington approach. You take a current marketplace and try to shoehorn it into a statutory and regulatory framework that has become pretty creaky and yellowed with age. The TCPA is a great example for this. And I think one of the reasons why I was so excited to read the Supreme Court's decision in Facebook last year was that they finally recognized, unanimously, I would add, some of the arguments that I had been making all the way back when I was a commissioner in 2015. For example, just a basic thing, the definition of an autodialer. I mean, I have argued that the TCPA is actually one of the most successful statutes ever enacted because it attacked and solved the problem that it was designed to create. But as a result of some of the terms being a little constricted, a lot of regulators have tried to define an autodialer as basically any connected device, whether it's an actual autodialer or a smartphone or anything that can transmit and receive data. And so one of the arguments I made to my colleagues at the FCC, to the courts, and to Congress was, if you want to solve a problem, pass an updated law that recognizes that the marketplace has changed. Don't try to shoehorn all of messaging and everything else into this constricted old framework. And that's something that I hope Congress will do. And I don't have a lot of hope for Congress acting in a bipartisan way on much, but hopefully this is an area where they can come together. So anyway, all of which is to say that I'm proud of the work that we did on the TCPA to try to recognize that if something is going to happen here, it will have to happen in our halls of Congress as opposed to any temporary majority at the FCC making it up as they go along. And secondly, with the Twilio petition, as you may know, we made the decision a few years ago to reclassify SMS and MMS as information services as opposed to telecommunications services. And it might have been a controversial decision at the time, perhaps even among some of you, but it kind of reflected my basic philosophy. I mean, number one, I think clearly as a statutory matter, a lot of the messaging that was at stake really did meet the definition of an information service in terms of acquiring and storing information and the like. But even more than that, I think it established that we want to see light touch regulatory parity among all services. RCS and RTT, for example, are not regulated as telecom services. There are many other types of messaging that aren't regulated as utilities, essentially, as Title II utilities. And so we wanted to make sure that we put these other legacy services, so to speak, on a similar footing. And I'm glad we did that because over the past couple of years, I think experience has shown that if anything, the marketplace has gotten much more innovative, much more competitive, and it's demonstrated that that is really the paradigm. The question is not so much what or how to regulate, but when to regulate. And in my view, regulation is typically, preemptive regulation is appropriate only when there's this sort of demonstrated market failure, when the marketplace just fails so much that nothing other than utility-style regulation would work. Messaging is not that, it seems to me. And I think the comments of Soren earlier just speak to the point that you were trying to convene, figure out who the bad actors are, and on your own, identify them and get them out of the marketplace, which is what consumers want. If the FCC stepped in and did a utility-style regulation, yeah, sure, you might solve a little bit of the problem in the short run, but over time, it has all kinds of effects on investment decisions. It sort of preempts the self-regulation that he was talking about, and it can take you in all sorts of different directions. And so, anyway, all of which is to say that our work on messaging hopefully resonated with some of you and has allowed you to do what you do best, which is to present to consumers a more vibrant messaging marketplace, which is where I'll leave it. I won't go to the Interstate Commerce Act, but I will close. I know that most of you focus on maybe B2B or B2C type messaging, but I thought I'd zoom up to 60,000 feet. I was thinking about this last night, and because we live in the moment, it's often difficult to recognize how dramatically things have changed. And I'm now at the age, I suppose in a way it makes me a curmudgeon, but I'm at the age now where I think, oh my gosh, think about how things were when I was a kid. My family, for example, came from India in 1971, and I still remember when I was a child in the late 70s, early 80s, if I wanted to call my grandparents or my aunts and uncles and cousins in India, the way that we had to do it was on the Indian side, they had to block a 10-minute block of time at the post office because people didn't own their own telephones for the most part. At least my family certainly did not. And then they would call us. And those calls would typically come at 2 in the morning, and on our side, everyone had to be really efficient and get in their points very quickly because the phone would literally go dead at the 10-minute mark. And I remember as a child often wondering, I wonder what all my cousins are doing way back there. I wish we could stay in touch. I wish there was a way, short of writing them a letter or doing these ridiculously abbreviated phone calls and the like, to stay in touch with them. And that yearning for basic communication is something I think is common to every person. And you fast forward to today, it's just incredible to me how messaging has helped solve this basic problem. We now have a group on my dad's side of the family. We are strewn all over the world, Australia, England, continental Europe, the US, even South America. And we have a single WhatsApp group that allows us all to stay in touch immediately. I know exactly what people's kids are doing. I know what's on their minds. And it's just a basic way of staying in touch in a way that was literally impossible just a generation or two ago. All of which to say that I know that in your daily lives it's probably a slog trying to figure out how to solve the next problem, but I do hope that you recognize that the value you're bringing to this marketplace is not just financial for your company or academic for those who are watching from afar. It's really meaningful to consumers like me and people around the world. So yeah, I do hope that you'll keep up your spirits and keep up the great work, because at the end of the day, what you're doing is solving a basic problem that has foiled humans for thousands of years and is now on the brink of finally getting solved, which is near instantaneous communication with those that you want to hear with. And that's not a bad way to put in a good day's work. So with that, I just want to thank you again for your indulgence, and happy to answer any questions that TJ or you might have. By the way, while we do that, can we just have a hand for Susan? She is amazing, just organizing all of this. All right. Boy, an open mic and a captive audience. This could be karaoke afternoon.
Exactly, yes. Two Asians met on a stage.
Yes. Just in case, well, yeah, I should probably stay away from that one. Yeah.
So, thank you, first of all. That was very motivating. Let's jump right into one question that I have as a sore loser, because you know this, but I want to share it with the audience. I was on the other side of the net neutrality debate where...
I'm not familiar with that issue. What is...
so... I had my reasons for why I think there had to be utility style treatment, and so what would you tell a sore loser like me, as to because both orders were about 534 pages, and in this era of Twitter headlines fighting each other, what is a one click down? You say, okay, you made good points, but
I think the best argument that proponents of net neutrality made, and perhaps including you as well, was that what we really needed in the United States was more competition. That to the extent you have a competitive marketplace, the types of bad behavior that internet service providers could engage in would be mitigated because consumers could easily switch. And I recognize there are parts of the United States where either there is no access at all, or there might be only one meaningful provider that provides broadband. And so one of the things that we tried to do outside of the context of the net neutrality decision was to promote a lot more competition. I mentioned some of the digital divide work we did, but even beyond that, we freed up a lot of spectrum that is now being used. For example, those of you who live in exurban or even rural areas, you might see T-Mobile 5G and home internet. I mean, that's leveraging in part the 2.5 gigahertz spectrum that we made available for them. And other carriers are doing the same thing, providing a real competitive alternative. T-Mobile in the last quarter reported something like 400,000 or 500,000 new subs. I mean, those are new subs that are switching away from somebody, presumably. Same thing on the fixed side as well. We encouraged a lot of these incumbent telecom carriers to stop investing in copper TDM networks and start investing in fiber. And we had rules on the books that required them to do that. And so they're now investing in fiber. Part of the work I do at Searchlight, my firm, is to invest in companies that have historically underinvested in their networks, put cash on the balance sheet, and fiberize their entire network to provide a meaningful competitive alternative to cable incumbents. And we're taking share as a result of that. So I think that was one of the things that was very helpful that proponents argued about. Some of the other claims about what would happen, this is the end of the internet as we know it, you're going to have to pay $14.99 for Twitter each month, if only. But a lot of those never came to pass. And I wish that people in the future would focus on just what is really at stake in this issue. It's not just the beating the table and saying the world is going to end, but you're really trying to figure out how do we provide a more competitive marketplace that maximizes the incentive of companies to invest in infrastructure. As I'm seeing now, broadband doesn't fall from trees. Your capital doesn't have to be raised. Work crews don't have to be hired. Networks don't have to be built. And so the harder the regulatory framework is to do that, which I would argue Title II did, the less likely consumers are going to benefit at the end of the day. So, but it's kind of funny now how that's sort of receded in the minds of many people. I ran into this guy at the airport a couple of months ago, and he came up to me and he had that look. Well, I don't know if any of you have ever served in office, but he kind of had that look. I'm like, oh man, here it comes. And but he's like, yeah, look, I hated your guts 5 years ago. But yeah, actually things have turned out all right. Like I have cheaper internet today than I did. I was like, you got to be kidding me. And then he said, oh, can we just take a selfie? I'm like, oh, that's all you want to ask for? Absolutely, let's do it. And it's kind of those types of interactions really remind me that at the end of the day, we did the right thing, even if I paid a pretty severe political or personal price for it.
And let's talk about that a little bit because, you got a lot of flack. And honestly, you could have easily said, this is the law of the land and I don't need to touch it. But you decided because you had a strong belief that that was the right thing to do for the country. And you got a lot of flack for it, personal as well. Let's talk about that a little bit because I remember you couldn't make it to a conference here in Vegas because there were threats to your life.
Yeah, it was a very unfortunate. I mean, this is CES in 2018, and I love going to CES. I mean, I'm hard pressed to think of another show where you just see right in front of you all the innovation that's about to come. And we couldn't go. We just couldn't go. We had credible threats, and I remember some activists and journalists were mocking me for it. But what I couldn't tell them, which came out finally a few months later, is that a few weeks before, this guy had emailed me. And he had emailed me 3 different emails. One was a picture of my wife and kids with me. Another email was a list of all the preschool addresses near my home. And a third was, I'm coming with an AR-15 to your home and I'm going to murder your children. Like that's pretty messed up. And other threats like that. And so my team said, look, we do have some chatter that something's going to happen at CES, so we recommend you not go. And it was hard for me not to be able to describe why. But people spiking the football like, oh, see, he's afraid of getting criticism. Like that's just the kind of that's the nature of the beast, unfortunately, that we live in. And it's kind of interesting. I mean, the only concrete effects of the decision were that guy went to jail, and a few others went to jail as well for threatening us. And it's just unfortunately part of the noise that accompanied that decision. And I certainly hope that nobody else who is ever in a position of power has to encounter any of that. I have a pretty thick skin, but when your kid can't take the bus to school in kindergarten, when your wife's online reviews go to 1, when your in-laws get called at 3 in the morning months afterward with people cussing them out randomly, like that's not right. And and also the mockery of my ancestry and all the rest of it. Like I'm pretty damn proud to be an American, but also pretty damn proud to be an Indian, and I don't apologize for any of that. So anyway, sorry for the rambling answer, but it does exercise me even 5 years later that what me and my family went through was not right.
And thank you for sharing that, because it talks to the principled stance you took, because it's easy to say the previous administration or the previous person did this decision. Why do I need to ruffle feathers or poke the bear? And you decided to go after that. So thank you for that.
No, I like I said, as you said, we weren't just marking time. And I had this quote from Winston Churchill on my desk. When I powered up my computer, I'd always look at it. And he wrote it in 1928 to those in the UK. And I thought it resonated with me. And the gist of the quote was, "Hear this, young people, and proclaim it far and wide. We are needed now more than ever before. Take up the mantle of change, for now is your time." And I know it sounds cheesy, but it reminded me every day that we don't have these positions for years on end. And while you have a chance to make a difference, make a difference. You take the risk, spend your political capital down to 0 if you have to, but those who are successful are the ones who made a mark, who are in the arena. And yeah, things definitely got tough on spectrum or net neutrality or whatever, but I was often reminded of one of my favorite political philosophers, Gandalf, who, as you might remember in The Lord of the Rings, when Frodo was complaining about, can't believe I have to carry this ring to Mordor and blah, 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 Gandalf looks at him and he says, "But that is not for us to decide. All that is left for you to decide is what to do with the time that is given to you." And so no matter how hard it got, I always looked at that quote and said, when I leave on January 2021 or whenever it is, I want to be able to say I left it all in the field. And I think I certainly did that.
Thank you for that.
Oh, thanks. Thank you.
Another fact that I didn't know until I was doing research on this stage was,
Don't believe what you read on the internet about me.
well, you were an Obama appointee.
Yeah.
And a unanimous Senate vote. And then you got appointed by President Trump as chair. How do you marry the dichotomy between the two administrations?
They're pretty similar administrations. I'm just kidding. No, I mean, I'm sort of this weird. There are a few of us who got in touch across the different agencies, Obama and Trump appointees, and to me, there are two things that made it possible. Number one, the FCC is an independent agency. Even though we're appointed by a particular president and confirmed by the Senate, we operate independently. We don't take orders from anybody. And so we're somewhat insulated from some of the typical vicissitudes of politics, usually. But the second thing is also that telecom is one of those rare things that pretty much everyone agrees on, outside of net neutrality, of course, but getting people better broadband, establishing 988, getting people better wireless service. Like, these are things that historically have not had a Republican or Democratic bent. And so for that reason, I'd like to think anyway we've slipped through the cracks. And for me personally, anyway, I met President Obama in the 90s, believe it or not. When I started at the University of Chicago for law school, I remember seeing this young new professor walking around the hallways, and like, oh, who is that? Oh yeah, he's this hotshot guy who just got out of Harvard Law School, and he's got political ambitions. Like, yeah, right. Don't we all? Right? And so I wish I had become better friends with him back then. But I did get to know him in the Senate a little bit when we were both there, and in the White House as well. I mean, he was obviously very supportive of my nomination. And same thing with President Trump. When I interviewed with him when he's president-elect, in Trump Tower, you walk along the hallway, and I was getting flashbacks. I realized, oh my God, this is from The Apprentice, like where the contestants go after the. So I just hope, I wanted him to say you're hired as opposed to you're fired, but it was sort of the same thing. When I interviewed with him at the end, he said, look, I'm going to give you the job, do the job you think is best, and we'll back you 100%. And when it came to things like Spectrum, they certainly did. So it was kind of an odd 8 years, the whipsaw effect, but nonetheless, I can say I'm proud to have been appointed by both of them. It was. It was a good time.
Thank you. You did get some flack for independence, even from both administrations, but from the Trump administration as well.
Yeah, it wasn't easy. And for those of you who are interested, all two of you maybe, there's a speech. The very last speech I gave was in January 15th of 2021, where I talked about 4 decisions we made that pissed off somebody. In some cases, it was Congress, the Democrats in Congress. In some cases, it was the president himself. In some cases, the Department of Defense. And the bottom line is that we didn't do it to upset anybody, but we did it because we thought it was right. And just one example I'll give you about that. I remember I was preparing for a congressional hearing on July 24th, I believe it was, of 2018. And I thought, oh man, I've got this hearing nailed. I know the issues. I feel pretty confident in my answers. And then my phone starts blowing up. Like, oh my God, the president tweeted at you. So I look at my phone, and it was in the context of the Sinclair Tribune merger. These broadcast stations were looking to merge, and I decided the right thing to do based on the law and the facts was to block the merger. And we did that. And the president wasn't happy about it. And so he tweeted out something like, Concast, not Comcast, but Concast, gets this merger with NBC, but somehow Sinclair doesn't get to merge with Tribune. I can't remember, what is Ajit Pai FCC doing? Disgraceful was the last word. And of course, my chief of staff, so I'm a glass half full kind of person, if you can't tell. My chief of staff was very much glass half empty, and he was just like, oh my, this is the worst thing in the world. I told him, look, Matthew, this is the greatest thing ever, because it shows that we did the right thing, even though we get the hit from the most powerful person in the world. And I'm going to stand by this decision. And the next morning at the congressional hearing, the first question I got was, well, are you going to resign? Are you going to cave or whatever? And I was like, hell no. Like, I did the right thing, and I would do it again. And interestingly, after that, I met with the president privately in October of 2019. And so he brought this up, and I said, look, I told you what I would do. I would always do the right thing, and I did it. And I think the fact that I pushed back made him respect that. He was like, okay, yeah, and so then we had there was an event that happened right after that was reported in the press where he said, yeah, Ajit made this one decision that I didn't like, but he's independent. And I was like, that is exactly right. And had I not pushed back, had I caved, in that particular case or in any of these cases, once a politician or once somebody outside the FCC knows that you're gettable, the game is done. You've lost your independence and integrity, and then you're just putting your finger in the wind. That's a very bad place to be for a regulator.
I agree. And in the interest of time, I do want to switch gears a little bit.
Sure.
I spent a lot of time pitching to the FCC and honed my craft through both the Wheeler FCC and the Pi FCC, so I apologize for all the poor presentations. But what would you give advice to entrepreneurs right now who either basically look at a regulation as something they don't want to deal with or as an annoyance? What were the good presentations you saw where they were making a good case for what was needed and some of the not so good ones?
Yeah, I think, to me at least, the best presentations, and I should predicate my answer on the following statement. As a commissioner and as chairman, I always took meetings really seriously. I was willing to do a lot of advanced work. For example, if it's a publicly traded company, I would always read the 10K before a meeting or an 8K or whatever filings they had done with the SEC. I would read the website. I would know the teams, the people we were meeting with. So the best presentations to me were the ones where they would send you a lot of information in advance, so you don't waste the first 5 to 10 minutes with chit chat and, oh, here's what we do, and here, that's filler. I want to get to the meat of an issue. And I'm sure a lot of people I met with, if you had the misfortune of meeting with me, it was like, oh yeah, we really got through a lot, and it was very quick. But the reason was I wanted to understand from their perspective, what was the problem, and could we solve it? Why should we solve it? And so those are the most effective presentations to me, the ones that really got to the meat of the issue very quickly. The other aspect of it that was really effective was those presentations where they would try to understand things from the FCC's perspective. I mean, every company that comes in will say, look, if you don't give the solution to me, our world is going to end. The entire world is going to end. And those, after a while, you just start to tune those things out. But the really effective presentations were ones where they would say, look, this is the problem. This is why it should matter to you. And this is why we think you have the power and should have the willingness to solve that problem in the way that we are advocating. And some of that happened in the P2P context, which was really effective. But I would definitely urge people, don't come in and just say, look, we're great and our competitors are awful and give us what we want. I mean, that's just never going to resonate. At least it didn't resonate with me. Maybe it would with some of my successors. But you really think carefully about how to use those 30 minutes, because it's, especially nowadays when the FCC is bombarded with all kinds of different issues from all sectors, your ability to break through is very, very limited. So you have to pack as much punch as you can.
I agree. Thank you so much for those questions. I would like to open up to audience questions. We have 2 mics somewhere in the audience. And just introduce yourself and your question.
And just to clarify, this is not over the broadcast airwaves, so you don't have to keep it clean.
Sorry you had to go through that cyberbullying and threats from your family and so forth.
Oh, thanks.
I definitely believe the campaign registry is a great first step for us to regulate big digital data. I would love to see this. I mean, our data is being discriminated against, but Facebook's isn't. I think if people identify themselves, whether they're sending a text message or posting something online, I think it would mitigate and diminish a lot of this hate and violence that we're seeing and misinformation online. So I would like to see a type of campaign registry expanded to all digital platforms.
That's a great point. I mean, I think, to be frank, the likelihood of that happening is far greater in Europe than in the United States. The U.S., as you may know, is always struggling with how to approach digital platforms, and on things like privacy, for example, where it's pretty obvious there needs to be a federal solution as opposed to a state-by-state solution led by California. There's still just an inability to come to a considered conclusion on it. So I would certainly hope that the U.S. Would embrace your vision, but I'm not optimistic that it'll happen. Yeah, exactly right.
So we're getting precedents to solving this problem, because we're not going to fix any of our problems unless we start communicating and having conversations. And disinformation and people who are obscure because they're not identifying themselves to who they are. And these platforms are media platforms and need to be held accountable to, as well as broadcast and print media. And they need to be held liable and accountable, like we are.
Right. No, you make a lot of good points, and but we'll see what Congress decides to do, whether they take the baton.
Thanks.
Thank you for your questions. Is there another question in the back?
Hey,
Hi.
Matt Chatton from Weave Communications. Do you have any tips, I suppose, for how to deal with like being a kind of media punching bag or having to deal with the public hate that you faced? I'm kind of curious, as probably one of the leading experts and kind of suffering through that.
Yeah, it's quite something. I mean, you sort of, gosh, how to approach it. I mean, one is just to keep putting yourself out there. For better or worse, I was the first FCC commissioner on Twitter. I'm a pretty active user of it, and I kept wanting to engage on that platform. And sometimes members of my team would say, like, why bother? First rule of the internet: don't feed the trolls. Like, you're feeding the trolls. And but I said, look, there are a lot of people out there who are never going to have the wherewithal to come to Washington, to visit the FCC, to read what it is we're doing. But I'm quite confident that a lot of the things we're doing are relevant to them. And so I want them to know that I visited the Jemez Pueblo in New Mexico, and thanks to an FCC policy, a school in the Pueblo is getting internet for the first time. I want them to know about 988. I want them to know that I personally went to Puerto Rico immediately after Hurricane Maria and tried to help restore communications there, because otherwise, if I don't fill that vacuum with the positive stuff we're doing, it's going to be drowned out, by all the noise. So that was one thing, just to remain engaged on social media platforms. The other one is just to do as much sort of traditional media as you could. I'm pretty sure I did the most broadcast and cable news interviews, and sometimes with hostile fora, but it was really helpful to get the word out in that regard. And the other one, I guess, would just be personal. It's hard, no doubt about it, but you've just got to summon up the strength within yourself to be a friendly, optimistic person. I grew up, as I said, in Kansas. I just have optimism bred into me. But even now, it's hard for me to look people in the eye if they're strangers, because I'm just not, so trained from 2017 and 2018 not to make contact. But I'd have to overcome that in myself. And you just have to. I think former President Bush said it well, that all too often. What do you say? Something like, we always look for the worst in other people as opposed to the best, or something along. He phrased it much better than I do, but I still hold out hope that the vast majority of people are overwhelmingly good, and even if they disagree with you on an issue, when they see you face to face, when they engage with you, there's a lot more commonality there in our experience than dissimilarity. So anyway, sorry for another rambling answer, but oh, sure.
Is this thing working? Okay.
Yeah.
Since I got you here and we're not online, I got to switch gears.
Oh, here it comes. You're the guy. All right.
Yeah, if you were, I'm Sam, call hub, do a lot of political calls.
Yep.
If you were king, prime minister, chairman, I don't know, whatever, how would you change the TCPA? Like, we currently, there's a amendment bill up that would just remove random or sequential number generation out of it and just say anything automatically. We got the Florida bills, the Oklahoma bills, the Michigan bills that are all talking about sort order. And like Michigan has the old people, you can't call them after 7 o'clock. Nuts. But like, yeah, if you were, seeing what you've seen and everything you've gone for, What do you think? Is that the correct vehicle? Would you do something differently, or how would
That's
you
a
change?
really good question. So I haven't had occasion to, well, certainly haven't had occasion to think about, deigning myself king or prime minister or whatever. God help us all if that ever comes to pass. But no, I think that, to me at least, I would certainly, gosh, how would I approach it? So the basic problem with the legislation in this area is it's a pretty dynamic marketplace, and so as soon as you pass a statute, it becomes yellowed with age, and so I'm very skeptical of Congress's ability to legislate here, any way that has enduring effect. So what I would prefer for Congress to do, if it does anything at all, would be simply to update, just sort of establish some core principles that we want the industry to abide by. We want consent, for example, to be something that is sort of the touchstone of the consumer experience, or we want people to be regulated similarly, so we're not, sweeping in SMS and MMS, but not RCS and RTT, or auto dialer. We don't want everything to be construed in auto dialer based on the whim of a regulator. And if Congress establishes just general principles and then delegates to an administrative agency to administer those principles, a regulator can adapt to the times. But what is really hard is when you say, an auto dialer is this, it has the ability to store or produce, with random or sequential number generation. And then you see the regulators like, okay, well, it's 3 decades old, but let's see if we can make it fit. And the Supreme Court has to correct the error. So it's just it's a very tough area of the law. And increasingly, I'm very, very skeptical that just Congress can legislate on any type of technology, especially IP-based technologies, in a way that's going to have lasting effects.
Time for 2 more questions. Harsh is next from Netsphere.
Okay. Oh, hey. Someone at the FCC should look into that.
Yeah, thanks. So my question is around encryption. So when it comes to the over-the-top messaging platforms, there is a big regulatory push to kind of mandate how end-to-end encryption should be implemented by basically leaving a backdoor open for the regulators to, right? So how do you see that, evolve, right? Because looks like the regulators are not giving up on this agenda.
Yeah, boy, that's a very tough one. I mean, luckily for me, at least, the FCC didn't regulate in that area, so we were, of course, aware of it what the Department of Justice and other law enforcement agencies were pushing for. And we are aware, of course, a lot of the tech companies were trying to resist it, Apple most notably in, 2017, 2018. So I'm not sure where it's going to go, but at the end of the day, I mean, law enforcement swings a pretty big stick in this area, and so when they argue, look, end-to-end encryption is going to enable, essentially facilitate a lot of bad behavior, that's really difficult for elected officials and other policymakers to resist. On the other hand, it's very difficult to. I definitely see the value in in allowing end-to-end encryption, and so there's a basic consumer appeal to it that's very hard to resist as well. So you sort of have this immovable object and irresistible force situation, and to be honest, I just don't know. I mean, even in my own mind, to be candid, I go back and forth on where I fall because, as I said, one of the things I had the ability to do was to get classified briefings, and you can see some of the things that happen on these networks. I mean, just horrible types of conduct that cause real harm to real people. On the other hand, I do see the benefits of end-to-end encryption, especially in places of the world where people aren't free to speak their minds, and the communications networks are literally their only lifeline to the outside world, and encryption ensures that they won't pay the price for what they say or think. And so it's just a very, very difficult issue, and I don't pretend to have a silver bullet solution, I'm afraid.
Yeah, no, thank you for that, because the arguments on the both sides are very compelling.
Yeah.
And that's why, it's kind of it's very uncertain.
Yeah,
setting.
absolutely.
Thank you.
But if you ever figure it out, let me know. I'd love to learn more.
We can take one more question. Does anyone have a question? Okay.
Well,
You do it.
Thank you, Brad.
Here's a softball ender for you.
Love it. Pandering to your speakers is always highly appreciated.
Yeah, absolutely. As you look back, was there anything that you weren't able to accomplish for various reasons, barriers, et cetera, that if you could just wave a magic wand, that you would remove all the barriers and just do this?
Wow, that's a great question. That's a really good question. Boy, what did we not do that we wanted? You know what? Actually, here's the answer. So back in 2013, I came up with a proposal when I was a commissioner, and the proposal related to what's called the E-rate program. For those of you who don't know, E-rate supports educational institutions, schools and libraries getting connectivity like fiber to the school or library or Wi-Fi routers and the like. It's essentially allowing students to learn over connected devices and whatnot. And so the proposal I had was to fundamentally reform the system. The current system is you have to fill out 7 different forms over 6 different steps. And if you make a mistake on any given form, you get the 1 digit of the zip code wrong, you're sucked into an appeals process. It can last up to a decade. And so when I became commissioner, some E-rate appeals had lasted for 15 or even 20 years. In the meantime, a lot of the students who were meant to benefit from this funding had already graduated from high school. And so my idea was, instead of this very arcane system that kind of dictated to the schools and libraries what services they can get on what time frame, what if we made it just a per student approach, where a school would essentially tell us, this is how many students we have, and you would multiply that by a formula. You get a certain amount of money per student. If you're a low-income school, you would get a bump in that amount. If you're a rural school, you would get a bump. Very simple to administer. I got a lot of support from educators and ed tech people and the like. And when I became chair, that was one of the things I asked my team, was like, hey, could we actually implement this proposal? And for whatever reason, it always seemed to fall behind in terms of the workflow. And that's one of the things that really does bug me, especially in the wake of COVID, because when COVID hit, of course, you saw these images of kids sitting out of McDonald's, just trying to piggyback off the restaurant's Wi-Fi. And I sometimes wonder, if we had gotten that across the finish line by March of 2020, when the world was turned upside down, how many kids wouldn't have had to think of that as a limitation on learning? And so that's probably my one big regret, is that we just couldn't find the bandwidth, pardon the pun, to enable those reforms to be done. And I hope somebody else will take up the torch of that 2013 idea, because what did Whitney Houston say? Our children are the future. So, connect them well and let them lead the way. That's really the 21st century's mantra when it comes to educating our kids. So hopefully that's the problem that someone will solve in the time to come. But I appreciate that.
Thank you very much, Ajit. That's been great.
Oh, thanks so much.
Thank you so much. I know. Thanks.
Derek.
Only one. Then I'll do TJ for a second while TJ comes. And thanks again, Ajit. It was a fantastic chat, and it's great. It set the tone for the rest of the day, I believe. We want you to be open. We want you to be passionate, and it's slightly controversial. Why not? I like that too. Talking about changing perspective, TJ, you can come up if you want, but we got Lauren. By the way, might need to change to the next speaker as well. We have a change in perspective. From a regulator, we go to one of the leaders in the industry that is calling the shots about doing business. So we want 180 degrees. So I'm very glad to welcome, now I'll do your job, TJ.
Yeah, exactly.
Welcome Lauren Nemeth, the SVP and GM of Communication Platform from Twilio.
Hi, good morning. My name is Lauren Nemeth. I lead, it says communications platform, but it's kind of a fancier title to say all of our messaging businesses at Twilio. I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about some of the areas of innovation that we're seeing from a messaging perspective. As you probably know, we work with about 300,000 customers directly all across the world. So we see a lot of different innovation on the platform, from really big companies all the way down to long-tail developers. So I want to give you some perspective in terms of what we see. But I want to start out by just saying none of this is going to be possible without a trusted ecosystem. So one thing I want to make sure that we're all working on today, and obviously TCR is a really important backbone to all of this, is building trust with consumers is the most important thing that we can actually do as an industry. So we'll talk a little bit about what we're doing there as well. So first, I like to start with where we all came from an A to P perspective. 30 years ago, this was kind of the first message. Fast forward, we are now sending trillions of A to P messages globally, which is amazing. And we're powering, quite frankly, really cool use cases. So if you think about the retail use case, I can now give my information directly to a retailer and say, hey,